I'm Mike. This is Mike on Media. Today I'm breaking down the movie Shame. This movie is perhaps one of the most misunderstood movies of the last 2 decades, if not more. Want to know why? Stick around and find out. Released in 2011, Shame is a British erotic drama set in New York City. Directed by Steve McQueen. No, not that Steve McQueen. He's been dead for 40 years. This Steve McQueen. And co-written by McQueen and Abby Morgan, the film stars Michael Fassbender and Carey Mulligan. Notably, Shame is the movie that McQueen did just prior to 12 Years a Slave, which was released 2 years later in 2013, also starred Michael Fassbender in a supporting role this time, and won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. McQueen and Fassbender were nominated for Best Director and Best Supporting Actor, respectively, but neither of them won. Because Shame deals candidly with adult themes, most notably the lead character Brandon's sex addiction, it received an NC-17 rating. As a result, despite significant critical acclaim, the film remains relatively obscure, particularly in the United States. My name is Brandon. I live in New York City, alone. I'm addicted to sex. I seduce women, hire prostitutes, and masturbate constantly, even at work. I have a sister, Sissy. She keeps calling, but I ignore her. There's an attractive woman on the subway. I stare at her. She stares at me. Turns out she's married, but I don't care. Where'd she go? Coming home, an intruder is taking a shower in my apartment. I'll attack him with a baseball bat. Oh, wait, it's just Sissy. My sister's standing naked in front of me. Nothing to see here. So, Sis wants to stay at my place. I agree, reluctantly. David, my boss, and I go see Sissy sing. Her performance is amazing. David's surprised by Sissy's scars. Sissy sleeps with David. I'm angry, so I go running. Sissy tries to climb into bed with me, but I lose it. At work, IT figures out my computer is full of pornography and computer viruses. David assumes my old intern is to blame. I don't say anything. Marianne's a hot coworker. I have a date with her, but it's awkward. The next day, I take her to a hotel. At first, it's good, but then it's not. Marianne leaves. I have sex with a prostitute instead. At home, Sissy talks to me. At first, it's nice, but then it's not. I go out all night drinking, having sex, getting beaten up, and ignoring calls from Sissy. Finally, I get home and find Sissy. She survives. I break down in frustration. Attractive married woman on the subway is back. She's even hotter than before. What will I do? Movie ends. Shame is a prime example of Ernest Hemingway's theory of omission, sometimes called the iceberg theory. The idea is that the writing in this type of work of fiction is like the 1/8 of an iceberg that's visible above the waterline. The parts of the story that are not directly communicated are similar to the 7/8 of the iceberg that's below the water's surface. These unseen parts of the story are often more important in terms of influencing the story than the parts that are explicitly communicated. Generally, Shame is thought to be about Brandon's sex addiction and the negative impact it has on his life. The truth of the matter, however, is that Brandon's sex addiction is not the primary conflict at the center of the story. In fact, it's actually a byproduct of the primary conflict and, truthfully, not even all that important. A few reviewers were bold enough to suggest that the movie had hints of incest, suggesting a prior sexual relationship between Brandon and Sissy. The reality is that this prior sexual relationship is not only hinted at, it's clearly communicated, albeit subtly, and it is the conflict at the center of the movie's universe. Every other meaningful aspect of this story is derived from the past sexual relationship between Brandon and Sissy. And importantly, it's about this relationship and not sex addiction that Brandon, specifically Brandon, feels shame. As we'll see, Sissy is less conflicted about what the rest of the world thinks. She understands that Brandon feels shame, and she may feel a little shame herself, but she still romantically loves Brandon, and because of her personality, is more willing to embrace her feelings, come what may, or, in other words, the world be damned. One of the first points to address about the movie is the naming of the characters. In works of fiction, the character names are often important and meaningful. In this case, it's especially true. Let's start with the easier of the two. Sissy's name is a bit unusual but straightforward to interpret. The name is derived from the essence of her character, which is that she's Brandon's sister. You cannot have an incestuous brother-sister relationship without a brother and a sister. Sissy is the sister. Understanding the importance of the name Brandon, on the other hand, is trickier. However, as we'll see, it's fundamentally important. Brandon is a common contemporary name. On first inspection, it seems innocent enough, but this character's name is far from arbitrary. The key to understanding the name's importance is realizing that Brandon can be broken down into two words, brand on. This is meaningful because there is figuratively a brand on this character. In other words, because of these names and for other reasons, we can infer that Brandon and Sissy had an ongoing sexual relationship that became known to the people of the small town where they grew up. The two were branded as immoral, incestuous lowlifes. For lack of a better phrase, Brandon was branded a sister f***er. This type of verbiage, being branded, is common when discussing incest. You can find real-world examples of the word branded being used in reporting on incest in general and incidents of brother-sister incest in particular. Here's an example. In reality, both Brandon and Sissy have been branded, and both of them were traumatized by the experience, which is, at least partly, why Sissy has evidence of prior self-harm behavior. But Brandon is brand on because he cares more about what people think. He's now trying to live his life within the boundaries of social norms in the aftermath of the experience by forsaking the one relationship that he believes is the root cause of all of his problems. And the only way Brandon knows how to leave the relationship behind is to completely shut out Sissy from his life, which he is doing from the very beginning of the movie. Sissy understands what's going on, and she's desperately trying to prevent it. Now that we understand the central conflict, let's go through the movie and further understand how the different scenes support the idea. The beginning of the movie immediately sets the stage for the dynamics of the story. Brandon refuses to pick up his phone. Sissy leaves message after message, revealing that she's made several attempts to contact him, which he's ignored. With this introduction, we understand that Sissy wants to see Brandon, but Brandon is avoiding her. The early scene where Brandon silently flirts with and then pursues, but ultimately loses track of an attractive married woman on the subway, is primarily created to bookend Brandon's character between this scene and its counterpart at the end of the movie. There's some important symbolism going on with the scarf that Brandon is wearing. I'll come back to that near the end. Most of the rest of the beginning is establishing Brandon as somebody who is truly addicted to sex and also has a natural ability to seduce women. In contrast, Brandon's boss David is quite inept in his extramarital pursuits of women. The drama of the movie doesn't really start until the inciting incident, which happens when Brandon comes home and unexpectedly finds Sissy in his apartment. There are several important details regarding the scene. The first is the music that's playing in the background. The song is called I Want Your Love by Chic. The symbolism is clear. Sissy put the music on signifying she wants Brandon's love. On the other hand, Brandon turns it off, representing his desire to move past their previous romantic relationship and his assertion that he no longer wants Sissy's love. Interestingly, in the screenplay, the song playing in the background is different. It's I Feel Love by Donna Summer. This alternative song that expresses almost the exact same sentiment reinforces the interpretation of the song. It symbolizes the romantic love Sissy feels for Brandon. When Brandon barges into the bathroom and Sissy ends up standing in front of him naked, the interaction is uncomfortable for those of us who are aware of and guided by the social norms surrounding brother-sister relationships. In particular, Sissy takes a towel covering her naked body and throws it at Brandon and says, "It's good to see you," in a way that suggests a longing for some reciprocation, as if she wants Brandon to say, "It's good to see you too," while she happens to be standing in front of him naked. At the end of the scene, Brandon picks up Sissy's scarf with his baseball bat and smells it. This is an unusual thing for a brother to do with his sister's scarf, and it definitely has sexual overtones. As I'll describe later, the scarves are used to symbolize the relationship between Brandon and Sissy. This scene of Brandon smelling Sissy's scarf is part of the establishment of the symbolism. Now, the orange juice scene that happens a short time later seems innocuous enough, but it's meaningful. Brandon hands Sissy a carton of orange juice. She drinks it from the carton, and Brandon admonishes her, saying, "You shouldn't drink straight from the carton." This scene is a simple metaphor for the characters. Sissy is unencumbered by social norms. She's more likely to do what she wants simply because she wants to do it, regardless of what other people think. Brandon, on the other hand, is less of a free spirit and more of a rule follower. He's more concerned about adhering to the expectations of others. This applies to the mundane activity of drinking orange juice, but it also applies to other things like sleeping with siblings. These dynamics are reinforcing the position that Sissy wants to continue the incestuous relationship with Brandon because she romantically loves him. Social norms be damned. Brandon, the rule follower, however, is no longer okay with the relationship. He's been traumatized by being branded and is having trouble even engaging with Sissy, let alone rekindling the relationship. The scene where Brandon and Sissy are waiting for the subway and Brandon pulls Sissy back from standing on the restricted edge of the subway platform is again a straightforward depiction of their two mindsets. Sissy is a rule breaker, determined to do whatever she wants simply because she wants to do it. Brandon, on the other hand, is a rule follower who tries to keep Sissy in check. Also, during the latter part of this scene, Brandon lets down his guard a bit and we can see glimpses of the relationship that the two used to have. When Brandon and his boss David go to see Sissy sing at the Boom Boom Room, there are important elements of the story being revealed. But first, as an aside, it's worth noting that Carey Mulligan's near a cappella performance of the theme to New York, New York is really amazing. It's a truly moving part of the film. Relatedly, Brandon having to wipe away a tear signifies that he truly still romantically loves Sissy, even though he is desperately trying to deny and repress his feelings. As with the song I Want Your Love earlier, the choice of song in this case is exceptionally meaningful. In fact, given the lyrics and how they relate to the story, I suggest that the entire setting for the movie was chosen because of this song. In other words, in terms of writing, the decision to use this song came first, and the setting for the story followed from it. The lyrics that are so important are the following two lines. "These little town blues are melting away. I'll make a brand new start of it in old New York. The importance of these lines are that they represent what Brandon is trying to do. The Little Town Blues, of course, refer to the trauma that he and Sissy experienced by being branded brother-sister lovers in their hometown. Brandon is trying to leave all of that behind him and make a new start in New York. Sissy is not letting him do it. Interestingly, the arrangement of the song has undergone a notable change. In the familiar Frank Sinatra or Liza Minnelli versions of the song, the lines about Little Town Blues happen twice, once early in the song and then immediately after the song's climax. In Sissy's version, the earlier instance of the lines has been removed so as not to dilute the impact of the remaining single occurrence. Also, the climax of the song has been enhanced with an extended silent pause in a way that emphasizes these two critical lines. Now, during David's conversation with Sissy, we learn more about her and Brandon. The more straightforward revelation is that Sissy has scars on her forearm that are indicative of prior self-harm behavior. She dismisses them by saying, "When I was a kid, I was bored." Undoubtedly, the self-harm was at least partially born out of the trauma that Brandon and Sissy experienced. The more subtle and more important reveal is that Brandon and Sissy grew up in New Jersey. Again, this sounds innocuous. They had to be from somewhere, and New Jersey is as good a place as any. Also, New Jersey happens to be next to New York, so much the better. But I suggest there's more going on here. As it turns out, 2 states in the United States are known for not criminalizing incest between consenting adults. One is Rhode Island, and the other is, you guessed it, New Jersey. This single line of dialogue is part of Hemingway's Iceberg, hinting at a significant, deeper meaning. Now, when Sissy makes out with David in the taxicab and then sleeps with David in Brandon's bed, she's doing it to make Brandon jealous. She's trying to make him confront the fact that he still has sexual feelings for her. The plan works in that Brandon gets severely upset and leaves to go running, during which time classical music plays. More on that later. Of note, the screenplay provides some related and interesting context, saying the following. Brandon doesn't want to hear. Brandon stands back against a wall, as if transfixed, as if he cannot take anymore. His breathing is irregular. Something of the past has come to the present. All of his distractions have now stopped. He is at once confronted with himself. His face bears the pain of something long past, but visually present. The wound has not healed. Of course, this passage is describing the prior sexual relationship between Brandon and Sissy without explicitly describing it. Brandon is still masking the true source of his feelings and will later claim that his anger has to do with David being his boss and also the fact that he's married, but that's not the real problem. In this part of the story, we can see further evidence of the importance of character naming. The fundamental reason for David's character to exist is so that Sissy can use him to make Brandon jealous. So, are there any other Davids that are known to have been the target of jealousy? Well, it just so happens that David is a biblical name and that in the Bible, King Saul was known to have become jealous of David. Now, some may consider this line of thought to be a bit of a reach, but think about this. Later, when Brandon enters David's office, David is video conferencing with his unnamed son. David says, "Mommy's picking up Nathan." This is important. We don't even know the name of the son that David is talking to, but we do know that he has another son named Nathan. So, who else had a son named Nathan? That's right, David from the Bible. In fact, there are quite a few names rooted in Christianity in this story. As another example, you can think of Marianne as a conjunction of Mary and Anne, which of course can refer to the Virgin Mary, and Saint Anne, the mother of Mary. On the other hand, Brandon and Sissy are decidedly not rooted in Christianity. In this sense, we can think of Brandon and Sissy as outsiders existing within the realm of religious doctrine that, to some extent, provides the basis for the shame associated with their so-called sin. Speaking of Marianne, Brandon's initial date with her is awkward at best. In the story, Marianne represents normal sexual relationships. Unlike most of Brandon's sexual encounters, he is shown pursuing Marianne through more traditional means, including the awkward first date. And while Brandon is very much in his element seducing women, he is uncomfortable in the more traditional role of dating them. This is why he comes across as nervous and ill at ease. Some of Brandon's interactions with the waiter are also written to illustrate how he can be manipulated to do what others want, even when it contradicts what he wants. For example, after the waiter asks him how he wants the lamb cooked and Brandon responds medium, the waiter then explains the restaurant recommends having it pink, and Brandon goes along with the waiter's suggestion. Here, Brandon is doing what other people want him to do because he thinks it's the right thing to do. If Sissy were ordering the lamb and the waiter made the same suggestion, she probably would have said, "Well, I want it medium." In addition to revealing Brandon's very cynical opinions on relationships, the dinner conversation also includes the interesting tidbit that Brandon and Sissy grew up in Ireland and moved to the States, presumably New Jersey, when Brandon was in his teens. This bit of backstory suggests that during the years of initial sexual awareness, Brandon and Sissy likely felt like strangers in a strange land and therefore came to rely on each other, and in so doing, developed an intensified closeness. These circumstances likely contributed to the sexual relationship that developed between the two of them. Brandon jokingly suggesting that he's a Neanderthal is again meaningful. In 2013, the first high-quality sequencing of a complete Neanderthal genome revealed significant inbreeding. I'll put some links in the description. So, if Shame had been written after 2013, this connection would have been almost obvious. Of course, Shame was released in 2011, meaning that at the time it was written, undeniable evidence of Neanderthal incest did not yet exist. Nevertheless, what did exist were substantial theories that Neanderthals engaged in close kin mating based on significant circumstantial evidence, including the existence of small social groups, certain skeletal clues, and a low genetic diversity as evidenced by initial DNA work done starting around 2006. So again, Hemingway's Iceberg. When Sissy comes home and accidentally walks in on Brandon masturbating in the bathroom, it creates an interesting parallel to the earlier scene when Brandon barged in the bathroom while Sissy was taking a shower. The resulting outcomes are completely opposite and reflect the differing mindsets of Sissy and Brandon. Sissy, when walked in on, eventually reacts with happiness, partially because she seems happy to have Brandon viewing her naked body. Of course, this is because she still romantically loves Brandon and wants to figure out how to rekindle their sexual relationship. Brandon, on the other hand, despite Sissy's initial giddiness at the circumstances, reacts with anger and violence, clearly stemming from his frustration with Sissy. Shortly thereafter, Sissy sits down in front of Brandon's laptop and happens upon a sex-based video conference where a nearly naked woman mistakes Sissy for Brandon's girlfriend. Here again, This is meaningful writing. In a story that has a clear subtext of a prior sexual relationship between Brandon and Sissy, somebody mistakes Sissy for his girlfriend. In other words, somebody mistakes Brandon's sister for the person with whom Brandon would be expected to be having sex. This is not accidental. It's not merely transitional. It's not inconsequential drama. It is more subtle communication of the implied sexual relationship between Brandon and Sissy. When Brandon tries and fails to have sex with Marianne at the Standard Hotel, we start to understand the depth of his sexual dysfunction. Having built his entire sexual identity on a foundation of secretive, forbidden, taboo sex, the idea of normal, socially accepted sex, such as he's trying to have with Marianne, is just not sufficiently satisfying. As a result, and despite being a highly active sex addict, he's unable to perform. Seductive conquest, prostitutes, and even gay bar encounters are all near enough to the edge of social acceptance that they satisfy his need. But having sex with Marianne under the pretense that the relationship might grow into something genuinely meaningful is just too normal. In the words of the script, at the height of this passionate encounter, Brandon's attention strangely, slowly starts to fade. It's as if the intimacy he has discovered starts to frighten him. He recoils, unable to continue. There's also a relevant clue in the lead-up to this scene. Again from the script, Brandon rolls up her skirt, laughs at her panties. Marianne giggles. Brandon laughs. Are they vintage? Marianne, a little bit, laughs. Vintage is another word for old or old-fashioned or traditional. Here again, the writing is emphasizing that Marianne represents a traditional sexual relationship. And of course, Brandon having sex with a prostitute in the same hotel room shortly thereafter shows that whatever problem he was having with Marianne, it was not a physical problem. The final very striking shot in the hotel room where a faraway boat in the nighttime darkness slowly disappears into the neck of Brandon's silhouette is some very stylistic symbolism. I interpret it to mean that his life, as represented by the hotel room where he failed to consummate his relationship with Marianne and then reverted to having sex with a prostitute, is slowly killing him. By the time Brandon and Sissy are talking on the couch in Brandon's apartment, the dynamics of their relationship have been established, which enables some meaningful and direct conversation. Though the scene quickly becomes confrontational, it starts out seemingly close and affectionate. Sissy asks Brandon for a hug, and he obliges, putting his arm around her. Of course, the hug feels more intimate than you would expect between a brother and a sister. Again, it feels like Brandon has momentarily let down his guard. We're getting glimpses of the relationship that the two previously had and precisely what Sissy wants again. When Brandon says he's not going to screw you again, referring to David, he reveals the raw essence of his jealousy, although he quickly tries to hide it behind the guise of David being his boss and also married. When Sissy points out this isn't about him, she's partially right. Fundamentally, the conflict is about the relationship between Brandon and Sissy, but Sissy is intentionally using David to trigger Brandon's jealousy. Regardless, Brandon's statements, "You trap me," "You're a weight on me," "You're a burden," are a legitimate distillation of his emotional state. Although the conflict has more to do with Sissy forcing Brandon to continually confront his traumatic past than it has to do with Sissy herself. Brandon complaining about Sissy not cleaning up after herself is a metaphor. Brandon is trying to clean up the emotional mess left in the wake of their prior trauma and move on. Sissy not only doesn't care about cleaning it up, she wants to embrace it. Just as Brandon had distilled his conflict down to very short, articulable thoughts, so too does Sissy when she says, "If I left, I would never hear from you again. Don't you think that's sad? Don't you think that's sad?" She knows that Brandon is trying to move on with his life by shutting her out of it. She knows that they both still love each other romantically, even though Brandon is living in denial of his feelings. She's pleading with him not to push her out of his life. There's really not too much to say about Brandon's all-night sex binge, apart from it illustrating his deteriorated mental state. The most significant parts of it are the voicemails that Sissy leaves near the end. When she says, "We're not bad people, we just come from a bad place," you can almost feel her rationalizing their relationship. In her mind, they should get a pass for loving each other because they've endured some significant trauma. Definitely in terms of the fallout of their relationship, but perhaps for other reasons as well. In this sense, the bad place is not so much a physical place, but more along the lines of, we've lived through some bad stuff. By the time Sissy says, "Thanks for letting me stay," you can hear the resignation in her voice that clearly indicates she's already decided to commit suicide. Interestingly, the screenplay clarifies the final subway sequence when Brandon is returning home. As is evident from the movie, the train is forced to stop slightly early because it has fatally hit a pedestrian. We see Brandon become increasingly concerned about Sissy, although it's not clear exactly why, except for the general possibility that it could have been Sissy who was struck by the train. Admittedly, the earlier scene where Sissy is shown dangerously close to the edge of the subway platform foreshadows the possibility of her being struck by a train. However, the script provides a detail apparently omitted from the movie. Brandon climbs the stairs, filing out of the subway, eyes catching on a woman's shoes, like Sissy's earlier at the Boom Boom Room, discarded. Brandon picks up his pace. In the final scene of the movie, the attractive woman from the beginning is again on the subway, and she's even more attractive than before. She's more nicely dressed, and her hair and makeup are both more striking. Furthermore, her silent flirtations with Brandon are aggressive. The suggestion here is that she regrets not having been caught in the previous pursuit, and she has returned trying to provoke another encounter. In a general sense, the movie ends before the audience gets to find out what Brandon did. I will point out, however, that we do see the subway train almost stop, whereas in the beginning, Brandon was standing up behind the woman well before the equivalent point. Regardless, as I will describe shortly, there is considerable reason to believe that Brandon does not pursue the subway woman because he has returned to having a sexual relationship with Sissy. One key element of symbolism is the use of scarves, especially by Brandon. As mentioned earlier, the sexual overtones of Brandon smelling Sissy's scarf when she first shows up establishes the use of scarves as symbolizing the relationship between Brandon and Sissy. For most of the movie, Brandon is shown wearing a gray scarf, often tied in a distinctive fashion around his neck. What else is often associated with being secured around one's neck? Certainly, a noose comes to mind, and one could make an argument for such symbolism. But there is a more fitting answer: an albatross. Having an albatross around one's neck means he or she is dealing with some kind of burden or a metaphorical weight. And it just so happens that Brandon used both of these words to describe Sissy. This is how we begin to understand that the scarf is symbolic of an albatross. But there's deeper meaning here. Specifically, the phrase of having an albatross around one's neck comes from a 1798 poem entitled The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Of particular note, the dead albatross is tied around the neck of the sailor, much the same way Brandon ties his scarf around his neck. Furthermore, in the poem, the albatross is symbolic of bearing a burden rooted in guilt or, wait for it, shame. Now, finally, the color of the scarf also matters. Sissy's scarf is red, likely symbolizing her uncontrollable passion. For most of the movie, Brandon's scarf is gray. Gray is a mix of black and white. Traditionally, black is used to symbolize bad, in this case, the socially unacceptable sexual relationship Brandon had with Sissy, and white is used to represent good, specifically the socially acceptable life that Brandon is trying to live. So, the albatross that's tied around Brandon's neck for most of the movie is an artistic battle between good and bad. Understanding the symbolism now allows us to fully analyze the final scene of the movie. Is Brandon wearing the same gray scarf tied around his neck? No, he is not. He's wearing a new scarf, and we can make two interesting observations about it. First, it's completely black. Second, it is not tied, rather it's neatly tucked into his jacket. The symbolic but clear message is that the so-called bad has won out over the good. In other words, Brandon has returned to having a sexual relationship with Sissy. And by virtue of the scarf not being tied, we can infer that he no longer has an albatross around his neck. In other words, he has come to accept the sexual relationship with Sissy. It is no longer a burden, or at least not to the extent that it was. Sissy's suicide attempt apparently made Brandon reevaluate his life and conclude that he truly romantically loves Sissy and that returning to the sexual relationship is the most likely way to ensure her well-being. This is why we can conclude that Brandon is not going to get up and follow the attractive woman on the subway. One final note on the music found in Shame. We've already seen that two of the songs are exceptionally important in terms of interpreting and understanding the story. It's also worth noting that the soundtrack features 4 different classical music tracks, all composed by Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, one might think that this is just related to wanting to have some classical music in the movie. After all, Bach is one of the greats. But you probably won't be surprised to learn that I suggest there's more going on here. In particular, apart from being one of the most famous classical composers of all time, Bach was also well known for marrying his second cousin. Now, not exactly the same as sleeping with your sister, but I suggest this little tidbit is part of the iceberg that's beneath the surface of the water. Finally, while writing up this analysis, I at one point asked myself, where might an inspiration for such a story come from? I decided to do some searching for documentaries about brother-sister incest. Given that the movie came out in 2011, I speculated that perhaps a documentary might have been made around 2008. Much to my surprise, my first search returned information about a 2008 documentary called Brothers and Sisters in Love, which was broadcast on the BBC. Of note, both of the co-writers, Steve McQueen and Abby Morgan, are from the United Kingdom. The documentary can be found online. I'll put a link to it in the description. It deals with what it refers to as genetic sexual attraction, or GSA. In particular, it looks at the phenomenon of brother-sister couples who were separated early in childhood becoming sexually attracted to each other when they were reunited as adults. Certainly, there's no evidence of this particular dynamic in the story of Shame. Nevertheless, it's easy to imagine that having watched this documentary, one might be motivated to write a story like Shame. Speculation to be sure, but certainly an interesting possibility. Also of note, the article that I used as an example of the branded terminology earlier is regarding a brother-sister couple that actually appeared in the 2008 documentary. As I've argued, there is much more going on with Shame than is readily apparent on first consideration. The use of Hemingway's theory of omission, extensive symbolism, lyrically important songs, and meaningful character naming all combine to create a movie that's almost completely different than the straightforward interpretation of the movie. As I mentioned in the beginning, Brandon's sex addiction, the thing that most people think the movie is about, is tangential and truthfully not all that important. This is why I suggest Shame is not only a great movie, but one of the most misunderstood movies of the last 2 decades. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. If you're interested in more movie analysis, check out this similar video from the channel. This has been Mike on Media. Until next time.